A millionaire CEO offered a little girl a toy or a job. Her answer shattered his entire world. John Richardson moved through the bustling city streets with his usual air of purpose, his polished shoes tapping a precise rhythm against the concrete as he approached the towering glass entrance of Richardson Enterprises. It was early morning, but the corporate world was already alive with hurried footsteps and briefcases swinging like weapons of ambition. John, clad in a light gray suit that hung perfectly on his broad-shouldered frame, was a man who commanded attention without a word. His dark hair, immaculately styled, gave way to piercing blue eyes that missed nothing and demanded efficiency from everything. Today was just another day of meetings, of deals to be sealed, and problems to be crushed beneath the sheer force of his will. But as he turned the final corner toward his building, something unusual caught his eye, something that didn't belong in his meticulously organized world. Standing near the gleaming glass facade were two little girls. They seemed so out of place amid the flow of business professionals, two delicate figures lost in a sea of sharp suits and determined faces. The older girl was perhaps 7, her blonde hair neatly combed, wearing a simple light blue dress that fluttered slightly in the morning breeze. Beside her stood a much smaller girl, no more than 4, dressed in a soft pink dress with a matching pink bow perched atop her fine blonde curls. Her tiny hand clung tightly to her sister's, her wide blue eyes scanning the crowd with innocent confusion. John's steps slowed. He had been approached by countless people over the years, vendors, activists, reporters, but there was something profoundly different about these two. The older girl, despite her size, stood with a composed, almost adult-like stillness, her eyes locking onto his with a quiet determination that caught him off guard. As he passed them, she took a small step forward and, in a soft yet unwavering voice, said, "Sir, could you spare a couple of dollars?" The words, though simple, landed heavily in the morning air. It wasn't the request itself that unsettled him, it was the way she said it, not with desperation, not with rehearsed pity, but with a calm, direct sincerity that felt disarming. John halted mid-step, turning fully to face them. He was a man used to people asking him for things, but they usually came wrapped in pretense. This was something else entirely. He looked at the girl, at her steady gaze, and then at the little one beside her, who was now half hiding behind her sister's leg, peeking out shyly. In his hand, John carried a leather briefcase filled with documents about expanding their new line of children's products. Ironically, nestled among them was a prototype of a plush white teddy bear, intended as a promotional item for a campaign targeting family values. He pulled out the bear, holding it up as he crouched to the girl's level. "Tell you what," he said, his tone casual but with a curiosity he hadn't expected to feel. "You can choose. I can give you this brand new teddy bear right now, or you can come work for me in my office. What will it be?" It was meant to be a light-hearted gesture, a way to offer her kindness while still maintaining his distance from the awkwardness of the situation. He fully anticipated a child's delighted squeal for the toy, maybe a giggle, maybe even a nervous glance. But none of that happened. Without flinching, without looking at the bear, the older girl answered with a clarity that seemed to pierce straight through him. "I'll work. I need to feed my sister." The air seemed to still around them. For a moment, John couldn't comprehend the gravity of what she had just said. He was so used to controlling conversations, to setting the terms and expecting predictable reactions. But here was this child, barely taller than his waist, giving him an answer that dismantled his assumptions in a heartbeat. His throat tightened unexpectedly. He turned his head slightly, pretending to adjust his sleeve, hiding the sting of a tear that had appeared without his permission. He quickly straightened his back, masking his emotions behind a neutral expression, but the impact of her words reverberated through him. There was no pleading in her voice, no manipulation. It was a statement of fact, raw and honest. The little girl wasn't asking for pity, she was offering to work. In her world, there was no luxury of choosing between comfort and responsibility. She had already chosen. For a man like John Richardson, who had spent a lifetime equating strength with control, this encounter was disarming in a way that no business rival had ever managed. His mind, which usually processed scenarios in terms of profit and strategy, found itself confronted with a reality that had no negotiation, no leverage point. This wasn't a case to be solved or a contract to be signed. This was life, in its most unfiltered form, standing in front of him. He didn't know what made him say it, but the words left his mouth before his logic could intervene. "Come with me," he said, extending his hand. The girl didn't hesitate. She reached out, grasping his hand with a grip that was small but steady, and together they began walking toward the glass doors of the building that bore his name. Her little sister followed closely, her tiny fingers curling around the edge of his coat as if she, too, understood that something had shifted. As they entered the building, the usual murmur of morning office chatter fell into a hushed silence. The sight of John Richardson, impeccable, untouchable, walking through the lobby holding hands with two small, street-worn girls was enough to halt even the most seasoned executives in their tracks. But John didn't notice the stares. His mind was elsewhere, grappling with a realization far more profound than the daily concerns of his empire. He had offered a child a choice between a toy and a job, expecting a moment of light-hearted charity. Instead, her answer had stripped him of his defenses, forcing him to see a reality that couldn't be dismissed with a transaction. He didn't fully understand why, but something inside him knew, this was not going to be a passing moment. This was the beginning of something that would change everything. John Richardson led the two girls through the marble-floored lobby of Richardson Enterprises, their small footsteps echoing softly against the towering glass walls. Employees froze mid-conversation, their eyes following the unusual procession with a mix of confusion and disbelief. No one dared to approach or question their formidable CEO, but the murmurs spread like ripples in still water. John, however, was oblivious to the commotion. His mind was consumed by a whirlwind of thoughts, none of which had anything to do with quarterly reports or profit margins. The weight of the small hand gripping his own anchored him to a reality far removed from the insulated world of corporate power. They reached the private elevator, and as the doors slid shut, John looked down at the girls. The older one, Sophia, he reminded himself, stood tall, her grip firm and unyielding, her expression calm yet guarded. The little one, whom he had yet to learn the name of, leaned against her sister, her thumb tucked into her mouth, her wide eyes scanning the elevator walls as if unsure whether to trust the gleaming surroundings. As the elevator ascended, John attempted to organize his thoughts, but every carefully structured argument unraveled the moment he glanced at Sophia's determined face. He was a man who prided himself on rationality, on logic, but none of his frameworks applied here. This wasn't a merger negotiation or a strategic acquisition. This was life, raw, unfiltered, and suddenly very personal. When they arrived at his floor, the executive suite, normally a space filled with decisive footsteps and clipped, efficient conversations, felt unusually hollow. The receptionist's eyes widened, but she quickly looked away, pretending not to see the sight of her boss guiding two dirt-smudged children into the heart of the company. His assistant, Claire, appeared in his office doorway, her tablet in hand, her mouth opening to remind him of his 9 a.m. call with the board. She froze when she saw the girls. "Clear my schedule," John said without looking up, his tone leaving no room for argument. Claire, who had worked with him long enough to recognize when to stay silent, simply nodded and disappeared. He motioned for the girls to sit on the large leather sofa in his office. The furniture, designed to impress billionaires and power brokers, now seemed comically oversized as the two small figures climbed onto it. John lowered himself into the chair across from them, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. For a moment, none of them spoke. The hum of the city far below filled the space between them. "What's your sister's name?" he asked quietly, not wanting to overwhelm them. Sophia's eyes softened slightly as she turned to the younger girl. "This is Lily," she said, brushing a stray hair from the little one's forehead. Lily gave a shy smile but quickly hid her face against Sophia's shoulder. John took a deep breath. He wasn't sure how to navigate this conversation. He had spent his life mastering the art of making people talk, but this was different. There was no angle, no hidden agenda. These girls had no reason to trust him, and yet, here they were, sitting in his office, their entire lives carried in their intertwined fingers. "Why were you out there, Sophia?" he asked, his tone gentler than he had ever used in a negotiation. Sophia's response was immediate, devoid of drama, simply a statement of fact. "Our aunt is sick. She sleeps most of the day. We don't have money for food sometimes. I try to find ways to help." John felt his throat tighten again. The bluntness of her words cut through him more effectively than any boardroom critique ever had. There was no self-pity in her voice. No resentment. Only a quiet, unwavering sense of responsibility that seemed painfully misplaced on such small shoulders. He wanted to offer them something, anything, a check, a place to stay, solutions wrapped in transactions. But as he looked into Sophia's steady gaze, he understood that offering charity would be the worst thing he could do. She didn't want to be saved. She wanted a chance to stand on her own, to be useful, to contribute. His earlier challenge, thrown at her half in jest, had been met with a gravity that now shamed him. John stood and walked to his desk, picking up the teddy bear that had started this chain of events. He turned it over in his hands, realizing how hollow the gesture had been. This wasn't what Sophia needed. She needed someone to believe in her, to give her a place where her determination wasn't dismissed as childish stubbornness. Returning to them, he crouched down in front of the sofa so that he was eye level with them. "Sophia," he began, his voice firm but kind, "when I said you could work for me, I didn't mean as a joke. But work here isn't what you think. We make things for kids. Toys, books, places for them to play. But lately, I think we've forgotten what really matters to children. You know that better than any of us." Sophia tilted her head slightly, processing his words. "I want you to help me understand," John continued. "You tell me what's right, what's wrong. You tell me what kids need. And we'll figure out a way to make it happen. You won't be a worker. You'll be my advisor." Sophia's eyes narrowed in thought, as if weighing his words for sincerity. Then, with a small but certain nod, she agreed. Lily, sensing her sister's acceptance, peeked out from her hiding spot and gave a tentative smile. John didn't realize it then, but that moment marked the start of a transformation he hadn't anticipated. The man who had always kept his world calculated and distant had just invited chaos and unpredictability into his life. But unlike the high-stakes risks of his corporate ventures, this was a gamble of a different kind, one where the reward was not profit but purpose. As the sun climbed higher, filling the office with a gentle, golden light, John sat back, observing the two girls who had walked into his life by sheer chance. He had no strategy for what came next. There was no spreadsheet, no 5-year plan. But for the first time, he was okay with not having control. Sophia had chosen to work, not for money, not for toys, but to feed her sister. And now, it was his turn to choose. He chose to listen. He chose to stay. The next morning, John Richardson found himself pacing his office far earlier than usual, his mind clouded with thoughts that had nothing to do with profit margins or quarterly forecasts. The weight of responsibility felt foreign, but not in the way high-stakes corporate deals once did. This was different, heavier in a way that reached into places he had kept locked away for years. The two girls, Sophia and Lily, were still sleeping in the adjacent lounge, wrapped in blankets far too large for their small frames. He had personally made sure the space was prepared for them, an action so out of character that even his most veteran staff were struggling to process it. Yet, for the first time, John didn't care what his employees whispered behind closed doors. As he stood by the window, staring out at the city skyline he had once believed he ruled, John realized how detached he had been from the very people who lived in the shadows of his glass towers. He had built an empire on precision, on control, yet here he was, standing in his own office, unable to control the whirlwind of emotions sparked by two children who had nothing to offer him but honesty and raw human need. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent his life believing that power insulated him from vulnerability, but now, vulnerability felt more real than any of his so-called triumphs. Claire, his ever-efficient assistant, entered quietly, carrying a folder filled with reports and a cautious expression. "Mr. Richardson, the board meeting is in 30 minutes. They're expecting your projections on the new product line." John barely acknowledged her presence, his gaze still fixed on the cityscape beyond the glass. "Cancel it," he said, his tone calm but resolute. Claire, who was rarely caught off guard, hesitated. "Sir, they won't like that." "I don't care what they like," John responded, turning to face her. "For years, I've made decisions based on what pleases shareholders. Today, I'm making a decision that actually matters." Claire studied him for a long moment, recognizing the unfamiliar conviction in his voice. With a small nod, she turned and left, her footsteps soft against the polished floors. Shortly after, Sophia appeared in the doorway, still in the oversized t-shirt someone from the staff had found for her to sleep in. Her hair was slightly tangled, her face still showing the remnants of sleep, yet her eyes remained sharp, focused. Lily trailed behind, clutching a stuffed bear, ironically, the same one John had once offered as a token gesture. Seeing them in his office, so small yet so composed, made him realize how absurd his previous life had been. Boardrooms filled with grown men arguing over numbers felt laughably insignificant compared to the quiet strength standing before him now. "Are we staying here today?" Sophia asked, her voice even, not hopeful, just seeking clarity. John gestured to the chairs by his desk. "Yes, if that's all right with you. I could use your help." Sophia climbed onto the chair with practiced ease, while Lily clambered onto John's lap as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For a man who had spent decades constructing emotional distance, the simple act of a child settling against him was disarming in ways he couldn't articulate. He opened his laptop, pulling up design drafts for the new children's product line, mock-ups of toys, packaging ideas, branding slogans that all seemed embarrassingly sterile now. "I want you to tell me what's wrong with these," he said, looking at Sophia. Her brow furrowed as she studied the images, her fingers tracing the edges of the screen. "They don't look fun," she said bluntly. "They look like something adults think kids would like, but kids don't care about shiny boxes. We care about what's inside. And this," she pointed at a flashy, over-designed toy, "this feels fake. It's like it doesn't even want to be played with." John felt a smile tug at his lips, not from amusement but from genuine admiration. She was right. No team of consultants, no focus group had ever given him feedback that honest or that precise. Lily, not to be left out, poked at an image of a sterile-looking playset and mumbled, "Needs more pink." Her comment was so perfectly innocent, yet so true, that John found himself laughing, a real, unguarded laugh that felt strange in his own mouth. Throughout the morning, they continued reviewing concepts. Sophia, with the seriousness of a seasoned advisor, gave candid insights that challenged the very foundation of how his company approached product development. She didn't speak in marketing jargon or statistical data, but in truths that resonated deeper than any report. For John, the experience was eye-opening. For the first time, the process of creation felt connected to the people it was supposed to serve. Around midday, Claire reappeared with lunch. Normally, John would eat at his desk, barely tasting his food as he plowed through emails. But today, he joined the girls on the office floor, where they had spread out paper and crayons, turning the sterile space into a chaotic splash of color. They ate together, simple sandwiches and juice boxes, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The walls of his meticulously designed office, once cold and impersonal, now felt alive. As the day progressed, the atmosphere shifted. The office wasn't just a workplace anymore, it was becoming a space of shared creation, of collaboration that went beyond titles and roles. John realized he didn't need a team of consultants to tell him what his company should be. He needed people who weren't afraid to speak the truth, no matter how small or unheard they might seem. By the time the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the expansive windows, John felt a sense of fulfillment that no financial victory had ever given him. Sophia and Lily had given him something invaluable, not just perspective, but purpose. They had reminded him that leadership wasn't about making decisions from an ivory tower but about listening, truly listening, to the voices that were so often ignored. As he watched them gather their drawings, Sophia looked up at him with that same steady gaze. "We can help you make things better, you know," she said. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a request. It was a simple offer, honest and direct. John nodded, feeling the weight of his past decisions, the empire he had built on efficiency and control, and realizing that perhaps, for the first time, he was about to build something truly meaningful. Not for the board, not for shareholders, but for the people who needed it most. And as Lily slipped her hand into his, humming softly to herself, John knew with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning. The days that followed felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory for John Richardson. His office, once a symbol of untouchable authority, had transformed into something far more chaotic and alive. Papers and design drafts were no longer stacked in clinical precision on his mahogany desk. Instead, they were scattered across the floor alongside crayon sketches and half-built toy prototypes. Sophia had claimed a corner by the window as her workspace, where she would sit with a clipboard, reviewing toy designs as though she were an executive herself. Lily, meanwhile, had taken over John's plush office chair, spinning in it gleefully, her laughter bouncing off the glass walls that had once echoed with tense, strategic conversations. Despite the obvious disruption to his structured world, John found himself not only tolerating the disorder but craving it. The rhythm of his days had shifted. His mornings now began with Sophia's blunt but insightful critiques of product concepts and Lily's eager demands for more colors in every design. His meetings, once filled with rigid agendas, evolved into open discussions, where ideas flowed without the suffocating filter of corporate jargon. The influence of the two girls was subtle but undeniable. They had given him a lens through which he could see the blind spots that his board of directors and consultants had never dared to address. But not everyone shared John's newfound perspective. Whispers circulated through the company's executive circles. Some saw his actions as a phase, a fleeting whim that would soon pass. Others speculated that he had lost his edge, that the once formidable leader of Richardson Enterprises had been softened by an emotional impulse. The board of directors, a group of men and women who valued predictability above all, began expressing their concerns with increasing urgency. They questioned the optics of a CEO involving street children in company operations. They worried about investor confidence, about the brand's image, about the risk of sentimental leadership clouding business judgment. John anticipated their resistance. For years, he had fostered a culture that prized numbers over narratives, metrics over meaning. Changing that culture was never going to be painless. Yet, as he sat through board meetings filled with veiled accusations and polite objections, he found himself unfazed. The old John Richardson would have responded with cold logic, with charts and forecasts. But now, he understood something the others didn't. The company's survival wasn't going to depend on its financial statements, but on its ability to stay human in a world increasingly obsessed with faceless efficiency. He listened to their concerns, their warnings of market repercussions, and then calmly asked them a single question. When was the last time any of you sat down with a child and asked them what they actually want? The silence that followed was telling. No one had an answer. They were experts in demographics and purchasing trends, yet none of them had a clue what children genuinely cared about. In that moment, the weight of their detachment became painfully obvious. Later that afternoon, as he returned to his office, Sophia greeted him with a drawing, a simple sketch of a playground filled with winding paths and cozy little corners where kids could sit and read or talk. "It's a playground where no one feels left out," she explained matter-of-factly. John took the drawing and pinned it to the wall, right next to the company's framed mission statement. For the first time, he saw the stark contrast between the two. The corporate jargon about innovative solutions and global outreach felt hollow beside the raw, heartfelt simplicity of Sophia's vision. That evening, after the girls had fallen asleep on the office couch, John found himself standing alone by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars. His reflection in the glass didn't resemble the man he had been a week ago. He wasn't sure what he was becoming, but for once, that uncertainty didn't terrify him. In fact, it felt liberating. He had built an empire based on control, on ensuring every outcome was calculated and predicted. But now, with Sophia and Lily unexpectedly woven into his daily life, he was learning to embrace unpredictability. And with it came a clarity that all his years of corporate success had failed to deliver. As the night deepened, he sat at his desk, sifting through the latest product proposals. This time, however, he wasn't looking for market potential or profitability projections. He was looking for heart, for authenticity, for designs that resonated with the very people they were meant to serve. He began marking up proposals with notes inspired by Sophia's feedback. "Too sterile, where's the fun?" he wrote on one. On another, he scribbled, "Feels like it's designed for parents, not kids." By the time the city outside had fallen silent, his desk was covered with revised drafts, sketches, and annotations. The office, once a temple of polished surfaces and controlled aesthetics, now reflected the vibrant messiness of creation, a space alive with possibility. In those quiet hours, John realized that his company didn't need a rebranding strategy or a new marketing campaign. It needed a soul. And surprisingly, it was two little girls who had reminded him of that truth. The next morning, he walked into the office with a different kind of authority. Not the icy, calculated dominance that had once made him untouchable, but a quieter, steadier resolve. His board would continue to resist, his competitors would continue to scoff, but John no longer saw those as threats. He had found something far more enduring than market share or quarterly profits. He had found a purpose worth fighting for. And as Sophia and Lily ran to greet him with their latest drawings, John smiled, fully aware that the most important decision of his life had been made, not in a boardroom, but on a street corner, when a little girl had chosen responsibility over comfort. That choice had changed everything. The fifth morning since Sophia and Lily had entered John Richardson's life began not with emails or board reports, but with the sound of tiny footsteps padding across the marble floor of his penthouse. It was still early, the city outside barely stirring, but within his home, there was already life. Sophia was in the kitchen, carefully pouring cereal into bowls, her brows knitted in concentration as though this mundane task was a matter of corporate significance. Lily trailed behind her, dragging a blanket and humming a tuneless song, content to simply be near her sister. John stood at a distance, watching them with a sense of quiet wonder. The penthouse, once an echo chamber of sterile luxury, now felt lived in, real, like a place that belonged to a family rather than an empire. It had been a week of subtle, seismic shifts. The office, which had initially tolerated the girls' presence as a temporary curiosity, was now adjusting to them as a daily fixture. Sophia, with her unfiltered honesty, had unintentionally assumed a role more influential than some of the senior executives. Her observations, though delivered with childlike bluntness, had begun shaping discussions in product development meetings. Lily, meanwhile, had become a small but mighty force of joy, her laughter disarming even the most hardened corporate veterans. But with every step forward, John sensed the looming pushback. The board of directors had called for an emergency meeting, citing serious concerns regarding leadership focus and brand direction. It was a thinly veiled ultimatum. The whispers had grown into open dissent. Some saw John's actions as reckless sentimentality, others as a dangerous detour from the company's profit-driven trajectory. He knew the meeting would not be a negotiation, it would be a confrontation. As he dressed that morning, adjusting his tie with practiced precision, John caught his reflection and paused. The man staring back wasn't the same one who had dominated boardrooms with an iron will. His face was still sharp, his stance still confident, but there was a softness in his eyes, a depth of understanding that had never been there before. For the first time, his strength was not defined by how unmovable he appeared, but by his willingness to bend, to adapt, to listen. When he arrived at the boardroom, the atmosphere was predictably tense. 12 pairs of eyes followed his every move as he took his seat at the head of the table. Charts and reports were already laid out, numbers highlighted in red as if to dramatize the supposed crisis his leadership had brought upon them. The chairman, a man named Whitaker, cleared his throat with the theatrical patience of someone preparing to deliver a verdict. "John, we appreciate your passion for community engagement," Whitaker began, his tone dripping with condescension. "However, the board is concerned that recent actions have diverted focus from our core objectives. Investors are asking questions. They want to know if Richardson Enterprises is still being led with the discipline and strategic foresight that built it into the market leader it is today." John let the silence hang for a moment, letting their rehearsed arguments simmer in their own self-importance. Then, with deliberate calm, he responded. "The discipline and foresight you speak of are precisely why we're having this conversation. You see, for years we've been building products for a market we no longer understand. We design for statistics, not for people. We innovate for margins, not for meaning. And that gap between our brand and our consumers is widening by the day." Whitaker's lips tightened, ready to interject, but John raised a hand, stopping him. "I'm not here to apologize for bringing 2 little girls into this office. In fact, I should thank them. They've shown me what all of us have been too arrogant to admit: we stopped listening a long time ago. They've taught me more about our consumers in a week than all of our market research has in 5 years." There was a rustle of discomfort around the table, but also a few glimmers of reluctant curiosity. John seized the moment. He slid a series of design drafts across the table, revisions born from Sophia's insights, from Lily's instinctive reactions. The concepts were simple yet profound. Playgrounds designed with no dead ends, toy packaging that invited exploration rather than flaunting features, community events that prioritized inclusion over spectacle. "These aren't just drawings," John said. "They're reminders of what we've forgotten: our responsibility isn't just to sell, but to serve." The board members exchanged wary glances. For years, they had navigated by data charts and forecasts, blind to the humanity behind the numbers. John could see the resistance in their faces, but he also saw the cracks. The truth, no matter how inconvenient, had begun to seep in. "We can continue as we have been," he continued, his voice steady. "We can squeeze out a few more profitable quarters before irrelevance catches up to us. Or we can lead. Not just in market share, but in meaning. The choice is yours. But understand this: I've already made mine." The meeting ended not with applause or declarations of support, but with a heavy, contemplative silence. Yet John knew that silence could be louder than any vote. Change, he realized, didn't always begin with consensus. Sometimes, it began with the courage to stand alone. That evening, back at the penthouse, Sophia and Lily were waiting for him with a new drawing. It was a city, drawn from a child's perspective, colorful, chaotic, alive. In the center was a playground shaped like a heart, pathways winding outward in every direction. As Sophia explained the idea, her hands animatedly sketching invisible lines in the air, John listened, not as a CEO analyzing potential, but as a father learning to see the world through his daughter's eyes. He pinned the drawing to the wall, next to the company's latest market projections. One showed where the company had been. The other showed where it could go. For the first time, John realized that legacy wasn't about what you built for yourself. It was about what you left behind for others. The road ahead would be challenging. The board would push back. Investors would resist. But none of it mattered as much as the quiet promise he had made, to Sophia, to Lily, and now to himself. He wasn't leading an empire anymore. He was building a future. And it would begin, not with numbers, but with a heart-shaped playground drawn in crayon. The following week marked a shift in tempo for John Richardson's life. What had begun as an impulsive act of humanity was now evolving into a deliberate, all-consuming mission. Every morning, the routine was the same. Sophia and Lily arrived at his office, not as guests, but as essential contributors. The once rigid environment of Richardson Enterprises had grown accustomed to their presence. Sophia had claimed a permanent spot in the product development team's war room, where she would sit cross-legged on the conference table, reviewing designs and asking the kind of simple, devastating questions that left seasoned executives fumbling for answers. Lily, ever the explorer, had turned the executive wing into her personal playground, her innocent laughter disarming even the sternest of faces. John, meanwhile, found himself splitting his attention between the dual fronts of corporate resistance and grassroots innovation. The board of directors remained cautious, if not outright skeptical. Investors demanded reassurances. But none of these pressures felt as immediate or urgent as the quiet conversations he was having with his daughters each evening. They spoke not in metrics or forecasts but in stories, feelings, and dreams, conversations that were slowly reshaping how he viewed leadership, responsibility, and success. One particular afternoon stood out in his memory. It had been a long, tense morning filled with back-to-back meetings where John had defended the company's new direction against thinly veiled accusations of emotional indulgence. As the meeting adjourned, his team filtered out, leaving him drained yet resolute. He returned to his office expecting a brief respite but found Sophia sitting in his chair, spinning slowly while scribbling in her notebook. Lily was asleep on the couch, clutching a sketchpad filled with her signature pink scribbles. Sophia looked up and said, "Dad, I think you need a timeout." The comment, delivered with childlike seriousness, made John laugh in spite of his exhaustion. He collapsed onto the chair across from her, resting his head against the backrest. "You might be right," he replied, smiling. Sophia, always more perceptive than her age would suggest, slid her notebook toward him. On the page was a drawing of a city square, filled with colorful booths, music stages, art walls, and, at the center, an open space labeled, "Listening Garden." When he asked her what that meant, she explained that it would be a place where anyone, kids, adults, strangers, could sit and talk, and people would listen without interrupting. The simplicity of it struck him. In the corporate world, listening was often a performance, a formality. But Sophia's concept was different. It was about creating a space where listening was the sole purpose, not a precursor to selling or persuading. That evening, John presented Sophia's idea to the design team. At first, the suggestion of a listening garden was met with polite nods and polite skepticism. But as he elaborated, describing not just the physical design but the ethos behind it, the room shifted. Designers began sketching, marketers started brainstorming how such an authentic, human-centric space could redefine community engagement. The concept sparked a new project, a public initiative that blended urban design with emotional connectivity. It was bold, unconventional, and it had nothing to do with product sales. Yet, John knew instinctively that it was exactly what the company needed. Throughout the week, John noticed small but significant changes within his teams. Meetings became less about posturing and more about problem solving. Departments that had once operated in isolated silos began collaborating, driven by the fresh, unfiltered feedback the girls provided. Sophia had become an unlikely catalyst, her honesty dismantling years of corporate echo chambers. Lily, in her own way, was bridging gaps that data analysts couldn't. She reminded people that at the core of every business strategy, there were individuals who wanted to feel seen, heard, and valued. Yet, despite the progress, John remained acutely aware of the fragility of it all. The board's patience was finite. Investors still needed convincing. And within himself, he battled the lingering fear of whether this shift was sustainable or merely a fleeting burst of idealism. He knew the system he was trying to change was not built for empathy. It was built for control, for predictability. And yet, as he watched his daughters navigate a world that had been indifferent to them, he realized that if he didn't fight to change that system, who would? One evening, after a long day of revisions and meetings, John took Sophia and Lily out for ice cream. They sat on a bench in a small park, the city skyline looming in the background. The conversation was light, filled with silly jokes and casual chatter, but then Sophia asked, "Do you think they'll let you keep me and Lily at your office forever?" The question caught him off guard. It was laced with an underlying fear, the kind of quiet insecurity that no child should ever have to carry. John turned to her, meeting her gaze with a seriousness that silenced even the distant hum of the city. "I don't need anyone's permission to be your father, Sophia. You and Lily aren't staying at my office. You're staying with me. Always." The words weren't rehearsed. They came from a place deeper than any boardroom resolution. And as Sophia nodded slowly, a faint smile curving her lips, John knew that this was the only bottom line that mattered. Returning home that night, John sat in his study, staring at the walls that had once displayed awards and certifications. Now, they were adorned with crayon drawings, sketches of cities, playgrounds, and gardens. It struck him how much more valuable these pieces of paper were than any framed accolade. They represented a vision not of power or dominance but of connection, of community, of a legacy measured not in profits but in people's lives. John understood then that his fight wasn't against his board or his investors. His fight was against indifference. And with Sophia and Lily by his side, he had already won the first battle. The road ahead would demand sacrifices, resilience, and unwavering belief. But for the first time in his life, John Richardson felt prepared, not because he had all the answers, but because he was finally asking the right questions. As the city lights dimmed and his daughter's quiet breathing filled the space, John felt a profound peace settle over him. He wasn't building a company anymore. He was building a future. And this time, he knew exactly what mattered most. The following month unfolded in a way that no business plan could have predicted. John Richardson, once the symbol of cold efficiency and corporate detachment, found his days orchestrated not by boardroom schedules but by the unpredictable rhythm of fatherhood and real human connection. Every morning started with Sophia and Lily arriving at the office with him, not as passive observers, but as participants who had, in their own quiet way, begun redefining the company's very identity. What had initially been seen as a strange phase by many of his senior executives was now turning into something undeniable, a movement within the walls of Richardson Enterprises that no one had expected but could no longer ignore. Sophia had seamlessly integrated herself into the design and product teams. She had no formal title, no office, yet her feedback was becoming a cornerstone of every major decision. She would sit at the large conference table, legs dangling from a chair far too big for her, as high-level executives presented their proposals with a newfound humility, fully aware that Sophia's candid remarks could dismantle a month's worth of polished presentations with a single, honest observation. Lily, in her own fashion, became the heart of the office. She would wander between departments, her curiosity creating spontaneous conversations, her innocence reminding everyone why their work mattered. Even the most jaded employees found themselves bending down to answer her questions, rediscovering a sense of purpose they had long forgotten. But as the internal culture began to shift, external pressures mounted. The board of directors had grown restless. Investors, driven by their need for immediate returns, were demanding answers. They wanted metrics, forecasts, assurances that this new, community-driven vision wouldn't derail the company's financial trajectory. John knew the storm was inevitable. The system he was challenging thrived on short-term gains and resisted anything that couldn't be quantified in quarterly reports. Yet, with every challenge thrown at him, his resolve deepened. One pivotal afternoon, John called for a full-staff meeting, a rarity in a company of their scale. The auditorium was packed, employees curious, cautious, some skeptical, unsure of what this sudden gathering meant. Standing at the front, with Sophia and Lily seated in the front row, John didn't begin with a speech filled with corporate jargon. Instead, he shared the story of how he met Sophia and Lily on that street corner, how a simple choice between a toy and a job had unraveled everything he thought he knew about leadership and success. He spoke not as a CEO defending a strategic pivot, but as a father, as a man who had been blind to the human side of his empire for far too long. He described how the girls' insights had reshaped product lines, how their presence had forced a re-evaluation of not just what the company made, but why it made it. He didn't sugarcoat the challenges. He acknowledged the resistance, the skepticism, the financial risks. But he also painted a vision of a future where Richardson Enterprises wasn't just a leader in market share, but a leader in responsibility, empathy, and community impact. Throughout his speech, the atmosphere in the auditorium shifted. What began as polite, reserved attention evolved into genuine engagement. Employees who had once felt like insignificant cogs in a massive machine now saw themselves as part of a story that mattered. It wasn't about profits for the sake of profits. It was about creating value that extended beyond balance sheets and into the lives of real people. The meeting ended not with a thunderous standing ovation but with a quiet, profound silence, a collective understanding that they were standing at the edge of something transformative. People didn't rush out. They stayed in their seats, processing what had just been said, knowing deep down that they were witnessing the rebirth of a company's soul. In the days that followed, something remarkable happened. Teams began self-organizing community projects. Departments that had rarely interacted started collaborating on initiatives aimed at real-world impact. The listening garden, once a whimsical sketch in Sophia's notebook, was now in active development, with urban planners and architects volunteering their time to bring it to life. Employees started bringing their children to work, not as a corporate event, but as a natural extension of their new company culture. The office walls, once adorned with sterile corporate art, were now filled with children's drawings, reminders of who they were truly working for. Yet, John knew the external battle was far from over. Investors were still watching, some growing increasingly uneasy. To confront this, he scheduled a private investor summit, an unconventional move that raised more than a few eyebrows. He didn't choose a luxury hotel or a corporate retreat. Instead, he invited them to the very first community space his team had developed, a modest yet beautifully designed park that integrated Sophia's ideas of inclusivity, connection, and playful learning. The investors arrived, expecting a pitch, a presentation filled with data projections. What they found instead was a living, breathing testament to the company's new direction. Families filled the park, children played freely, and everywhere they looked, they saw products, designs, and concepts that had been directly influenced by the very people using them. John walked them through the space, not with slideshows or spreadsheets, but with stories. He introduced them to families whose lives had been touched by these initiatives. He let Sophia and Lily explain their vision, their voices unpolished but filled with undeniable truth. The turning point came not through a financial argument but through a human one. Investors began to see that this wasn't a gimmick or a distraction. It was a long-term investment in relevance, in loyalty, in a brand that wasn't just seen but felt. The realization dawned that in a world oversaturated with faceless corporations, authenticity was becoming the most valuable currency. That evening, after the summit had ended, John sat on a park bench watching Sophia and Lily play. He felt the weight of the day lift off his shoulders, replaced by a quiet confidence. The journey was far from over. There would be more battles, more resistance. But for the first time, he wasn't walking that path alone. His daughters had not only changed his life, they had redefined his company's purpose. As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting a golden hue over the city, John Richardson understood that the future of his empire would not be built in boardrooms. It would be built in playgrounds, in gardens, in the simple act of listening to voices that had been ignored for far too long. He had found his legacy, not in towering skyscrapers, but in the laughter of two little girls who had taught him what it truly meant to build something that mattered. The culmination of everything John Richardson had been working toward came not in a boardroom nor during a televised press conference, but on a crisp spring morning in the heart of the city, where the very first listening garden was ready to be unveiled. The project that had once lived as a child's sketch, scribbled with colored pencils on a piece of printer paper, had now materialized into a living, breathing public space. It wasn't grand in a conventional, corporate sense. There were no towering statues, no excessive branding or polished marble structures. Instead, it was human-scaled, intimate, filled with meandering pathways, shaded nooks, interactive art installations, and benches deliberately arranged in quiet corners, designed for conversation and reflection. As John stood near the entrance of the garden, watching families and children explore the space, he felt a quiet satisfaction unlike anything he had experienced before. This wasn't the sharp, adrenaline-fueled rush of closing a billion-dollar deal. It was softer, deeper, a sense of fulfillment that came from knowing something real and lasting had been created, not for shareholders, but for people who had been invisible to his world for far too long. Sophia and Lily were already weaving through the crowd, their laughter mingling with the hum of conversation, guiding visitors through the park like proud ambassadors of a vision they had helped bring to life. The ceremony was understated. There was no need for speeches filled with corporate buzzwords. Instead, John had arranged for a group of local schoolchildren to perform songs and share stories about what it meant to feel heard, to feel seen. When his turn to speak arrived, John didn't stand on a stage, he stood among the people, without a microphone, his voice calm yet resolute as he recounted the story of a choice, one between a teddy bear and a job, that had altered the course of his life. He didn't embellish it. He didn't frame it as a corporate success story. He spoke as a father, as a man who had learned to listen not through market research but through the simple honesty of two little girls who had demanded nothing and given everything. What struck him most was not the polite applause that followed, but the sincerity in the faces of those who approached him afterward, parents, educators, even a few skeptics from the corporate world, each sharing stories of moments when they had felt overlooked, unheard, yet now found a space that acknowledged them. This, John realized, was the real return on investment, the collective trust being rebuilt, the quiet bonds forming within a community that had been yearning for connection. Later that afternoon, after the crowd had dispersed and the garden had settled into a peaceful hum of everyday life, John found himself sitting on a low stone bench, flanked by Sophia and Lily. They were eating ice cream, their feet swinging above the grass, their faces sticky with melted chocolate and strawberry swirls. It was an ordinary moment, yet it carried more weight than any business triumph he had known. Sophia, ever observant, looked up at him and asked, "Do you think they get it now? That it's not just about toys or buildings, but about listening?" John smiled, not because he was certain of the answer, but because her question reflected the very heart of what they had built together. "Some will," he replied. "Some will take longer. But it's not about everyone getting it right away. It's about never stopping trying." Back at Richardson Enterprises, the ripple effects were undeniable. Departments once entrenched in rigid hierarchies had begun fostering collaborative spaces, encouraging dialogues that valued lived experiences over polished presentations. Recruitment policies shifted to include voices from diverse communities, ensuring that the company's future was built not just by experts but by people who truly understood the lives they aimed to improve. It wasn't an overnight transformation, nor was it without its friction. But for the first time, there was a palpable sense of shared purpose. The employees, inspired by the very public evolution of their leader, had begun to see themselves as stewards of a larger mission. Investors, who had initially balked at the unconventional direction, slowly recognized the long-term value in authenticity. Consumer trust, once a fragile commodity in a saturated market, began to rebuild, not through flashy marketing campaigns, but through genuine, consistent engagement. The company's financial health stabilized, but what mattered more was the cultural wealth it had amassed, a wealth of goodwill, of relevance, of meaning. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting golden light through the windows of his home, John stood in the girls' room, watching them as they worked together on a new drawing. This time, it wasn't a park or a product. It was a house, simple yet vibrant, filled with open rooms where every door led to another path. "It's a home where no one ever feels stuck," Sophia explained, echoing the very words that had ignited this journey. In that quiet, sunlit moment, John realized that legacy isn't measured in the structures you build or the wealth you accumulate. It's measured in the spaces you create for others to thrive. Spaces where a child's voice holds weight. Spaces where leaders learn by listening. Spaces where community isn't a demographic, but a living, breathing relationship. As night fell, and the city outside glimmered with its usual intensity, John felt no urgency to return to his desk, to his reports, or to any of the demands that had once dictated his life. His empire had evolved, not in its scale, but in its soul. And it all began with a choice that seemed insignificant at the time, a choice offered to a little girl who had, in her quiet courage, offered him a far greater gift in return. The story of Richardson Enterprises would never again be told in the language of quarterly profits alone. It would be told in parks filled with laughter, in products designed with empathy, in communities where listening was no longer a rarity but a foundation. And at the heart of it all, John Richardson, the man who had once believed power was in controlling the narrative, now understood that true leadership was about letting others' stories be heard. As Sophia and Lily pulled him down to the floor, eager to show him the details of their new drawing, John smiled, fully present in the moment, aware that this messy, heartfelt, imperfect life, was the greatest success he had ever known.